Start our final session today. My name, as I said, is Felix Spranger, and I will just shortly introduce our last session. This will be a new format for today. So first we'll have a short impulse talk by Professor Atzler, who will be introduced later. And then we will have 1 hour roughly of discussion between 3 experts in various fields which concern the mobility system and different drivetrain systems, which are obviously very important for the mobility transition. After this 1 hour roughly discussion, you can join as an audience and leave your questions in the chat, and we can give them to the group afterwards. So this will further enhance the discussion, hopefully, and you can also give your input into our discussion. Moderating this discussion will be Professor Michael Bargin, who just arrived from Stuttgart. Thank you very much. He was born in Kreilsheim and studied mechanical engineering in Stuttgart. Then he was awarded his PhD from the Technical Universities of München and Darmstadt. Until 1989, he held various positions in the automotive industry, which obviously is very important for our topic tonight as well. First at Daimler-Benz and then the Mercedes-Benz AG. Since then, since '98, he's been part of the Institute of Automotive Engineering, first as a professor at the chair of internal combustion engines, and later at the chair of vehicle drives at Stuttgart. He's a consultant to, for example, the DFG, the Deutsche Forschungsgesellschaft, and also the REF, which is the Federation of Industrial Research Associations. His research focuses on making very efficient or developing very efficient combustion engines, as well as hybrid drivetrains and also fuel cells. And this overall expertise makes him a great moderator for tonight's discussion, which will hopefully involve all of these topics. Okay, and now for a short impulse talk of Professor Atzler. And I hope you will join our fruitful discussion.
So do I have to go? Yes? Right, so here we go. My name is Frank Atzler. I'm by trade a mechanical engineer. I'm a developer of combustion engines. So we always need some sort of justification why we're still here. And I'm going to try to motivate what we are contributing to the transition of energy and mobility systems. So what I want to do is I want to start with, now here, let's see where that clicks. Whether it clicks, it should, yes, here we go. So I want to give you an overview. Maybe I start with the second slide. People always talk about the renewable energies in Germany, and they talk about 40% or 50% renewables. And usually that is this slide, and what they're talking about is electricity only. So if we look to the greater picture, this is the overall energy turnover of Germany from the year 2019. In this case, I would cut out 2020 because that was Corona. And from these roughly 3,600 terawatt hours we had last year, only 3,200 or 300. But never mind, the order of magnitude remains the same. And out of these, we have only 15% renewables. And even if we assume that this year will be a normal year and we may rise up to 17 or 18%, it's easy to see that this is by far not enough. Now, if we look at the shares of important energies, and we see wind has a big share and PV has another big share, and the rest is like, you can mainly half this and say half of it is heat and the other one is electricity, and some of it is combined heat and power. But never mind, looking at the figures, only about 5% of the overall energy consumption is supplied by wind and photovoltaics. When I say overall primary energy consumption, that really includes everything: industry, households, transport, whatever, everything. So now we know we have too little of renewable energies. What can we do about it? One important point is that Germany, and I will motivate Europe as well, will always be dependent on energy imports. And currently Germany imports 68% of primary energy. So the next question is, how do we get green energy into Germany? And I will give you some information about these. First of all, we just look on this little box here. If we cut out the anthracite, which is stone or hard coal, lignite is brown coal, and nuclear, then we lose about 25% of our primary energy carriers. So what do? We import green energy carriers. How do we do this? First of all, obviously I have to prove the point. This is official statistics, as all the data I use here are official statistics. And this is the point for 2019, nearly 68% of imported energy carriers. And obviously when you now ask what's the situation in the rest of Europe, is not quite as drastic, but is very similar. Up to the year 2014, Germany was just over 60% energy imports, and the rest of Europe was between 45, say, and 55%. So not much less. We're mainly talking about orders of magnitude and not details. So how could we produce energy? Simple calculation. In the year 2018, we had about 30,000 wind turbines, and they yield about 126 terawatt hours. I was just saying total turnover was 3,600. So this is very little. Now we do a little calculation. We just double this number. We make that 60,000 and we repower them all with 3 megawatts. I heard that today you can even go to 4 or 5 megawatts, but just for the number's sake, let's stick to 3. So that gives us a total power of 180,000 megawatts, very easy. And then we use a load factor, which says how much time per year this runs full load. And I use the 23% out of the Fraunhofer statistics. I was just told by a chemist that another statistic says 17. Never mind. It's just talking about orders of magnitude. And that gives you 360 terawatt hours, so about 10%. And here I use an even better number. Is just my personal estimate that we will arrive at 3,500 or 3,400 terawatt hours. Doesn't really matter. It's not enough. Now, the next problem is we take these 60,000 wind turbines and cluster them 10 pieces per wind park, and now divide the surface of Germany by 6,000 wind parks, and we have then a surface square of about 60 square kilometers. And that is easy to calculate. 7 by 7 is 49, 8 by 8 is 64. So somewhere between 7 and 8 kilometers distance, we will have a wind park. So the question is, can we do that? Sounds possible, but the other question is how much resistance we get from citizens. I mean, if each village has its own wind park, this resistance might be much less. So we have to do something about the regulations in Germany. Nevertheless, a scenario with 60,000 wind turbines sounds, say, a bit unlikely in the near future. So what about PV? Photovoltaics, we do the same calculation. We take the surface of Germany, we calculate it in square meters, and then we just multiply the average yield, kilowatt hours per square meter in year. That gives a horribly big number. And now we take 9 zeros off to arrive from kilowatt to terawatt hours, and we see that this is a very huge number. So we take now 1% of the surface, and we arrive at 3,927 terawatt hours, which is pretty much what we use all over Germany. Oh, problem solved, nearly. Now, we include all the losses, and we produce methanol. I come back to methanol in a minute. So we take 3% of Germany's surface to arrive at a methanol production with all included an efficiency of, say, 33%. So what do we do with this number? We now take 3%, which is 10,700 square kilometers, and that is a huge number. Now we make PV parks 1 square kilometer each, because that's easy to imagine 1 by 1 kilometer of PV plates. And obviously, if we have an efficiency of 33%, we arrive obviously at 1 PV park per 33 square kilometers. So yes, sounds doable, but this number is really very big, so I don't know whether that will happen in the near future. However, it now gives you a handle what we possibly can do. We will never be self-sufficient, but we can do much more than we do at the moment. So what is the next best idea? Obviously, I come from this slide with the imports, and now we have a look at, well, the first question is, can we actually do, say, something like 30%? Yes, I think we could. The first thing we need to look at is administrative rules, and obviously whether we can convince the citizens to go with us. So if we now go and buy green energy somewhere, then the question arises, will it be electricity, will it be hydrogen, or will it be something else? And there is a couple of simple facts of physics, and I start with hydrogen. So what I don't want to do is I don't want to tell you that hydrogen or battery electric vehicles or something is nonsense. No, no, they are good all for their certain causes and purposes. But we have to have a technical look at, in this case, the imports. So hydrogen is liquid at minus 235 degrees C. So if you look at a hard winter, you have minus 20 outside and plus 20 inside. That gives you a delta T of 40 K. And here we're looking at a delta T of 270 or 280 K. So you need to keep that stuff cool. And the energy density, well, here the density is given 71 kilograms for 1 cubic meter. Water is 1,000 kilograms per cubic meter. Diesel, by the way, is 835. That's written down here. Methanol is 790. And because hydrogen is such a light substance, the volumetric energy density is only 2.3 kilowatts per liter. And if you just compress it to 700 bar, we arrive at about 1.4 kilowatt hours per liter. And that does not include the energy losses for liquefaction here and for compression here. So in small letters, I wrote down what the effective energy density would be. So if you now, for example, take methanol with a much higher density, you arrive at 4.5 kilowatt hours per liter. And one big advantage is it's liquid and at ambient pressure and temperature. So you can just fill it in a tank and transport it around the world. By the way, nowadays people look at ammonia, NH3, to transport hydrogen, and the synthesis is very easy. I was told by a chemist it's got about 98 or 99% efficiency, but the big problem is how to split it back up into hydrogen and nitrogen. I was told that this is not, well, it exists, but it's not a proven technology in huge dimensions. And that is one very important point, and that comes down here in red. We need to cover the energy demand of a whole country or half a continent or maybe of the whole world. So we need to think in immense quantities and scalabilities. And the same chemist who told the story about the ammonia and the methanol was the one who said, if I use a platinum catalyst, or I want to use a platinum catalyst to make a very fancy fuel, then this will be horribly expensive because the catalyst, obviously, for 10 million or 100 million tons of fuel will be huge. So what he suggests was we take something which is available, so that's CO2 and hydrogen, electrolyzed hydrogen. We put it into an iron oxide catalyst, and the whole thing is already scalable at a huge industrial size to immense quantities, and it's a robust and cheap way of production. And these four words, these you have to keep in mind when you think about solving the energy demands of the world. very quick excursion into what people call waste wind energy, because that was one suggestion how we could electrolyze hydrogen or do PTX production. But if you look at the statistics, we're talking about 5.5 terawatt hours, which is 0.15 of the primary energy turnover. So that won't save us. Then there is another big discussion. If we take 100% green energy and we drive around with it, well, we have an efficiency of 70%. If we use a fuel cell, then we lose quite a bit in logistics and infrastructure because, as I said, pressurization, liquefaction, etc., and we arrive at 26%. And if we make methanol, no, methanol is slightly better. This was referring to well, artificial diesel or gasoline, then we arrive at a very low efficiency. And yeah, that is one way of looking at it. But much more important is if you then take your infrastructure to the sunbelt of the Earth, where you don't have load factors of 20%, but of 60 or 70, and this has a huge impact on cost, on the price per unit energy produced. And if your methanol or your hydrogen from the sunbelt of the Earth is really very, very cheap, then it doesn't really matter whether you consume a bit more or a bit less. So we need, as I said in this, I just go back to it, that one, we need processes which are scalable, robust, and cheap to give us the fuel we need for the future. So the very fancy last words, this is the forecast of the government for 2015, and it says 1,900 terawatt hours. And this is a very low number compared to the 3,600 I was quoting, and which are in the statistics, obviously. All of this is public domain, so you can read about it. If you now go to another statistics, you look at the years 1990 to 2017 or 2020, and you make a linear extrapolation, and this is a friendly one because it really leaves those peaks above the line, then this optimistic linear forecast would rather point to 3,000 terawatt hours, not to 1,900. So there are a couple of questions to ask. And basically that brings me to the conclusions. If we have to import energy, and basically that is the background, if we want to stay industrialized and earn our money with it, we will import energy, then we will probably not be able to do that purely on wind and PV. Or also, we would then have a problem with storage of energy, meaning when the wind is not blowing and the sun is not shining, or the winter is very cold, we need a substance that we can use. And these chemical energy carriers will mostly be liquid. So, and this is what it says here, for the import, only energy carriers are suitable, which can be produced simply, scalably, robust, and cheaply. And that is one of the key sentences of this talk. Green hydrogen is obviously the base substance for all of these processes. And if we produce the green hydrogen where the sun is, so that is Africa, Australia, Patagonia, well, in Greenland and in Siberia, we would have a lot of wind, that would work as well. Then we can produce enough hydrogen for that. And obviously, if you go to mobile applications where you don't want to carry heavy add-ons like, batteries, and you want to go for very long distances, then the range and the energy density, the volumetric energy density comes back into play. So you see from these arguments here on the last page, it's not high science to solve the problems. The high science are in the details. How do you make the catalyst? How do you create your engineering to get all these appliances you need to make this work? But the thinking about the solution is rather simple. Maybe it's too simple, I don't know. And on the last page, because you will get the PDF, This is the short version, and on the last page is the extended version with many more arguments and a couple of more sources. And that brings me to the end of that talk. Thank you very much.
So, do we directly continue?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Stop sharing here. Maybe 1 second so I can adjust for everything and then we can start the discussion.
Anyone? I can have some water. After so much.
Oh, well, yeah, why not? Is it fizzy or is it not fizzy?
No, it's not fizzy, it's still.
Thank you.
So, you also? Some water?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, because then I can put the bottle down. And
Okay.
table. So, well, oh, nice picture. So, I'm the moderator and sitting therefore in the middle. And I must say many thanks for the introduction of myself. And I can say this is a completely new challenge for me, because usually I'm one of the panelists and not the moderator. So it will be a really big challenge for me to stay with asking questions and not to give answers. And we will see how it works. So
We'll keep you busy.
please be polite. So, well, we have 3 wonderful panelists here, and I'd like to briefly introduce them. And I'd like to start with Mr. Posdziech.
Yeah.
Easier than you can read it. He's head of large systems at Sunfire. Sunfire has a very good image when it comes to synthetic fuels, so-called designer fuels, it was called somewhere, isn't it?
Yeah.
So he studied fluid mechanics and thermodynamics at the Technical University of Dresden, here in Dresden, and before attaining his PhD in fluid mechanics in 2000. He has been developing fuel cell and electrolyser systems since 2002. And Oliver Posdziech joined Sunfire in 2011, where he's responsible for the large systems department. Sunfire is a Dresden-based company specialized in renewable energy systems, mainly hydrogen technology and fuel cells, developing industrial-scale electrolyzers. Maybe I was wrong with what I said. They also work on e-fuel now. It's getting better. They work on e-fuels and power-to-liquid technologies as well. Sunfire employs more than 250 people in Germany, Norway, and Switzerland, and has been mentioned in the Global Clean Tech 100, which names the most promising clean tech companies in the world every year since 2014. So the next panelist is unfortunately not personally present. So I welcome Mr. Lehmann. Yeah, he can hear us, and hopefully we can hear him too. Would you be so kind and say just hello, 1 word?
Everybody, I hope you are able to hear me.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you for the invitation, and I'm very sorry that I can't be there in person.
So, Mr. Lehmann studied business administration at Leipzig, Halle-Wittenberg, and San Sebastian in Spain, and received his diploma in 2004. Afterwards, he began his research career at the Helmholtz Centre for Umweltforschung, Helmholtz Centre for Environmental Research, including a research stay in Washington, D.C., I expect, or Washington State.
Washington, D.C.
D.C., okay, in 2005. From 2006 to 2009, he was a doctoral candidate at the UFZ with a fellowship of the Stiftung der Deutschen Wirtschaft. He received his PhD from the Martin Luther University in Halle-Wittenberg in 2010. From 2009 to 2017, he was a researcher at the same institute. He also was a visiting researcher at the Institute of New Economics Thinking at the University of Oxford. I'm very much looking forward to analyze is your English accent more an American accent or more a British accent? With your history This is interesting. Maybe a mix of both.
It depends on the context. If I'm talking to German, it's probably a German accent.
Yes. Sometimes the people say to me I'm South African because obviously I sound a little bit South African because with the Netherlands accent. In 2017, he became the head of the junior research group multiple IEEE at the University of Leipzig in cooperation with the UFZ. So there are even other things you have done in your business life, but I stop at this point because otherwise the introduction is not a brief introduction, not a long introduction. So now I come to my good friend, old fellow, Frank Atzler. He received his diploma in mechanical engineering from FH Regensburg in 1990. Of course, dealing with combustion engines. And from 1994 on, he worked on his dissertation as a Marie Curie Fellow of the European Union at the University of Leeds. So you could hear his accent is very clear and a British accent. I'm completely wow about this wonderful accent. And he was awarded his PhD in mechanical engineering in 1999. Afterwards, he has worked in industry, first focusing on combustion and exhaust gas after treatment at Iveco Motorenforschung in Arbon, Switzerland, and on the other side of the Lake Constance. And he then was the team leader for diesel combustion at Siemens from 2005 until 2016. He then was a professor for 3 years in Zwickau before he became the professor for combustion engines and powertrain systems here at the Technical University of Dresden. He is a member of several scientific organizations, and what we all are, very busy. We have only 24 hours a day. This is the only negative aspect. So, well, that's enough, I would say. And when I read, so let's start with the discussion. And what I've learned is that we have approximately an hour between us 4. And after this, we have 30 minutes where we can answer questions which come from the audience.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I will see these questions here on the screen. Good. So well, if I read the title, I read 2 titles. First, I read Technological Innovations for the Mobility Transition. Maybe this is the overall title. And then I read Alternative Fuels, which way forward for the automotive industry. And if I look, and we cannot avoid to talk also about politics.
No,
definitely. It would not make sense to do a discussion for 1 hour about technological solutions only, yeah, and keeping away the influence of the politics. So, and my first question is, when you read this just announced paper, Fit for 55, and the interesting thing is, it more or less refers just on Europe. Yeah, the only thing is that they want to avoid that any kind of indirect CO2 comes over the borders. That's it. So I miss seeing how can we work with other areas where we have more wind, where we have more sunshine, yeah, to overcome this lack of energy we have to face, as you perfectly described. Maybe Frank, would you like to say something about this? Let's call it what you wonder simply.
I didn't read the outcome of the.
I did it in the train.
The RED too, but yes, I heard it on Deutschlandfunk on the weekend that they want to put up a CO2 tax. Well, on the borders, on everything that comes in. to make us competitive and so on and so forth. Well, that's all good and well. That is looking at the current situation. Maybe that's okay. But what I miss, and I can't really speak for the EU Commission, but I see what the German government does, which is next to nothing, and that is obviously not enough. And if you look at the diverse parties and you see the Green Party, you always say, well, you're not allowed, you shouldn't, don't do this, don't do that. And then you see the Conservatives, and they want to avoid any rule for industry, which is not good either. So it doesn't amount to anything. Nobody drives it forward. If we would take these billions, which are going into, I didn't want to say purposeless things, but there are many, and just start to invest where the sun is or where the wind is, and make contracts with these countries, then I think that would help a lot more. It would get us much further. And whether we then take methanol or whether we take e-kerosene or e-diesel or whatever is a completely different question.
Thank you so much. Any additions, Mr. Lehmann?
Yeah, maybe I'm an economist, as you said, so I probably oftentimes will have a different perspective. So I'm lacking, of course, the engineering background. But so from an economic perspective, my first argument would be, I mean, what we do care about is reducing emissions. And I think it's a fair approach to focus policy on reducing emissions by pricing carbon, and not so much to focus on what you just said, I don't know, business initiatives or bringing in new technologies. Obviously, that's part of the policy mix, but I mean, the first priority should be that we price or reduce emissions by pricing emissions. And I'm simplifying, of course, and then the rest can be done by the industry. Maybe that would be like the first provocative point here, that I think it's generally okay not to regulate too much about the actual technologies and whether they're domestic or whether they're imported. The first thing you should do is put a price on carbon. Obviously, and my disclaimer would be, obviously that's not enough. We will need complementary policies. But so I think it's okay that the Fit for 55 per package focuses on carbon pricing and on border adjustment mechanisms.
I think the carbon price is a very good approach. It's just not high enough in Germany at the moment.
Yeah, obviously, yes.
But what I wanted to get at is not so much the economic aspect of trading. That is one thing. If you give Africa or South America a chance to make a product which everyone else needs, that goes much more towards fair trade than any other approach. But what I wanted to say was, if you're pricing carbon, then you have to distinguish between two kinds of carbon or carbon dioxides. The one that comes from fossil fuels, okay, that needs to be priced. And then the one that is renewable, that goes round and round and round in a technical circle. So you produce methanol, you burn methanol, you set the CO2 free, you take the CO2, make it back to methanol, and so it goes round and round. And that is CO2 neutral, and that you shouldn't tax.
I have the feeling that just to set a price on CO2 and provide certificates is just not enough, because there are huge investments required for renewable fuels. So for e-fuel, it's a gigantic sum of investment. And in order to get this money from the bank, we need fixed quota. Having certificates is too uncertain for to be bankable. So we need quota, say 2% of aviation fuels, maybe 10% or 40%, like sort in the RED II directive. So we need this in order to have an investment safety. Just let the market run. It's not sufficient at all. And the other
I perfectly agree on that. I mean, that's also why but I mean, the first best response to that would not be to have like renewable quotas. I am a fan of complementary policies, so I'm just, but just to make the argument clear. So the first starting point would be to introduce, for example, a price collar for the carbon pricing scheme, so that that your carbon price, because historically we have observed high volatility in the carbon market, and that's of course nothing which you want if you want to stimulate long-term investments. And so, in order to address that, the first best response would be to introduce like a price floor and a price cap in the EU emissions trading scheme, for example, because that would provide the certainty you need to make your carbon or neutral or your low carbon investments.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure about this. When you say carbon price, I expect you mean carbon dioxide price.
Exactly.
So, for example, if you put a carbon dioxide price on fossil fuels here in Europe, how can you know that this leads to the effect that crude oil stays in below the earth and is not used? So we have to be sure that this happens, because at the end this is the only thing which reduces CO2 emissions. If the CO2 emissions would be generated somewhere else outside Europe, nothing is done with this.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair point, of course. I mean, ideally, you would want to have carbon policies all across the world and not only in Europe.
Yeah, but you see, we have a high efforts, we pay high prices, and we are not sure that it's a true reduction of CO2 emissions at the end. If you are an economist, you would say this is a very bad deal.
Yeah, it is a bad deal compared to what we would want to have ideally. But I mean, it's not that we should compare our policies to the ideal, but we should compare our policies to us not doing anything. That's the benchmark, right? So the question is it better not to install a carbon price in Europe compared to having Europe as a carbon price? That's the comparison we need to do.
Okay.
I mean, obviously, there's lots of issues. You're perfectly right. There's carbon leakage. If we reduce emissions, then this will be partly replaced by emissions elsewhere. Yeah. But I would usually presume it's not one-to-one. And obviously, we should strive. I mean, there's this idea of a climate club, so that we try step by step to increase the area which is subject to carbon pricing by bringing in the US, by bringing in Australia, by bringing in China, who has recently launched an emissions trading scheme. So it's a stepwise process, and obviously, I mean, it's a lot of importance is to really like having taken this pioneer role, which may spill over to other countries. But we are living in a suboptimal policy world, obviously.
We all here agree when I say a true reduction of CO2 emissions is only possible if we leave fossil energy sources in the earth. If we leave them there, as long as these are, we have just seen from the OPEC that they increase the amount of crude oil they produce, because the economy is getting better on the planet. Yeah, and I thought by myself, okay, this is just the opposite of what Europe wants to have. Yeah, so and that's my question. If we can put a lot of money and effort and whatever in all these things, but if we don't reach the point where we leave fossil energy sources in the earth, it's nothing.
But I don't understand your statement, because do we want to discuss that if we reduce our fossil consumption, the others will increase it?
Exactly.
But it's just that. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, but there's
exactly.
But what is behind this argument?
Yeah, behind this argument is that
because they produce cheaper then, or what is the point?
Yeah, if we don't use it, it will be cheaper.
It will be cheaper, and then someone else uses it.
And someone else. I was very.
But that's just a claim. You don't know how the prices will develop.
Yeah, I heard this from I don't remember his name, from an English scientist. I was on a panel discussion with him, and I was when I thought about, so what can we do here in Germany to directly reduce CO2 emissions?
Not use fossil fuels.
I would not say, because fossil fuels is something we import. What
Yes.
can we leave in the earth as fossil energy carriers?
Of course, we can leave coal in the earth.
Exactly. That's the point.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's the point. Yeah, that's of course the lowest hanging fruits. Yeah, we need to of course to go behind it, and then we have the heating, we have transport systems with 30% of CO2 emissions, and we need to tackle also this, not only the electricity and not only the say the consumption of coal from the chemical or the steel industry.
Yes, but Michael, you saw the statistics I showed. So if you take the coal and the nuclear out, that's 25%. And if we manage to replace those 25% with green energy, then we've done something. We haven't solved the problem, but we have done a lot more than we do up to now.
We have done something directly.
Yes.
But something where we are really sure
and if
that,
we do
it helps.
If we do it properly, we have ramped up the production of green hydrogen, green methanol, or something else green. Because we have replaced the fossil fuels. So then we have already achieved something of scale.
But we have to, and I'm very much looking forward to hear your opinions. But we have to be aware in this case, as you just described, we have a lack of renewable energy production, especially when we look beyond the electricity needs we have.
Yes.
If we go to the needs of heat and total energy we need. And in this case, the question is, do we do enough to go out beyond our borders? Beyond the European borders. So look at the Saudi Arabian peninsula.
Yeah.
They have much better possibilities to generate renewable energy from
yes. And they do something very interesting. They put up PV fields, and I think the last number I had was 0.88 of a cent per kilowatt hour. And that is quite impressive. And what do they do with it? They make ammonia, and they don't have the problem that they have to split the ammonia back up, because they just use it to make artificial fertilizer. And because we were just sitting now this weekend, the last weekend we were sitting with the chemists, and the production of artificial fertilizers makes up for 4% of the world's CO2, and this can be replaced just by making ammonia in the desert.
Yeah.
So it's only a 4% solution for a world problem, but it's better than no solution.
Because
and it just
in the world we have enough nitrogen.
But to make ammonia and then split it back up, I think that's a stupid idea. I think the methanol is much better, because you can just use it. You can put it in tanks. You can use it when the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing, and you have a storage. Because also fluctuations in the delivery, for political reasons, for example, could be buffered if you have a storage. So an industrial country needs a storage of some kind.
Yeah. But you could also use ammonia directly, for instance, to propel a ship. So yes, it's not easy, and you have to change the complete energy system. But
a ship works. Sorry, pardon my French. On the last shit. I mean, the stuff we fire up in ships today is not much better than ammonia. But if you have a truck engine or a car engine or something, you need something slightly more sophisticated, and methanol is good stuff in that respect. And it's easy. As I said, it can be produced in scale, it's cheap.
So my question to this is, would it be not a good idea? Because I think we are running out of time when we look at the needs we have to bring down CO2. Would it not be a good idea to think about to shut down our brown coal plants much faster as we have planned it now? And I would say the more electricity consuming devices we put in our society, the longer it will take to bring it down.
You're not referring to battery cars, are you?
I am referring to more or less everything which consumes electrical energy. Yeah, well, produced here in Germany. Yeah, so and that's Poland. Yeah, so when I look, if you look at Poland, it will be a disaster. So I don't want to go into the extreme, but it's there, of course.
But nevertheless, it's only one step. So it's 15% of the primary energy, and so it's maybe 8% of the CO2 emissions, something like that.
Yes.
Because we already have 50% of renewables into the grid. Yeah. So we need to do much more, and we need obviously to do it quite urgently.
Exactly.
Not waiting for 2040 or 2050.
Exactly. And that brings me to the point. I had a meeting with a member of our parliament, and he's responsible for the hydrogen. The other day, the hydrogen strategy of the German government, and his name is Stefan Hoffmann. And he told me that the German government is talking to 30 countries worldwide about financing the production of green hydrogen.
Why don't we know?
That's interesting, isn't it?
I mean, that would be horribly interesting. That would be, I mean, Fridays for Future wouldn't have an argument anymore. They're talking to everybody, they're doing something.
They have not fixed any contracts until now, but they talk about this with altogether 30 countries. So there's a lot ongoing, which you cannot get from the media.
Okay.
Definitely. Yeah. So the hydrogen strategy is I would say one option beside pure electricity usage.
Well, I mean, that is another statement. We can't afford to concentrate just on one single solution. Yes. And to do it, I mean, if we refer now to transport rather than to the whole of Germany, then, I mean, driving a passenger car is about 10% of the energy, the total energy turnover. Another 12 is trucks and agricultural machinery and so on. Mm-hmm. So just making all cars battery electric puts more strain on the grid, fair enough. And it's hard to store, it's expensive to produce. There are good purposes for battery-driven vehicles. No argument about that. So,
I mean, the losses are very low.
The losses are very low, that's if you go to work and back every day in an electric vehicle, that might certainly be a good idea. If you live a bit further away from the city, if you live in the city, you don't need a car at all. Sorry. You could use a bicycle, but different argument. But to do it all electric is certainly not the way forward. You have to have other alternatives, and we can't afford to leave anything out. We have to pull all the levers and do everything. Yeah. Not everything which doesn't make any sense, all the sensible things. And to keep a combustion engine that gives you power at a price of 10 to 20 euros per kilowatt is affordable and robust compared to a fuel cell, which currently is still at about €1,000 per kilowatt and is supposed to go down to 150, according to an industrial partner who says in a couple of years he wants to be down to 150. It's still a factor of 10.
But so, my question is, why do we focus so definite solely on hydrogen when it comes to the chemical storage? Yeah,
this I don't
methanol. You explained that methanol is from every usage perspective much easier to handle. Yeah,
I mean, there are good and bad arguments pro and against hydrogen. Of course, if you use hydrogen as a fuel, you need a new transportation system, new infrastructure, everything. But on the other hand, you have lower conversion losses. And you could also transport hydrogen. You could put hydrogen into natural gas grids and transport over there, even from North Africa or from Russia or from Norway. That's not the point. Everything is possible, but of course the infrastructure is different. It's maybe not so complicated like an electric infrastructure, because the usage is quite the same as we have today with our diesel and gasoline fuel. That's quite nice, but of course it needs investment, and the powertrain is more expensive. So it's maybe not good for a private car, but for a truck where you have a lot of operation hours per year.
No, I think hydrogen is you said it yourself. If you have an infrastructure with pipelines, hydrogen is super, because you just put it in the pipeline, pump it there, use it there. Like the combined heat and power. You just put it anywhere, have a pipeline, fair enough. Steel furnaces, put a pipeline there, everything. But for a mobile application, I was told years ago by the same Michael Bargende that gas in vehicles is a no-go. You need to have pressure. You have pressure devices. If you look at the fuel pumps, look at them, how scratched they are, because people it is not a robust, easy to handle system.
When it gets older.
Yeah, I don't see, from a technical perspective, I don't see big troubles with it.
Yeah, it's a matter of how you define big.
But of course, e-fuel is also quite nicely. You can.
That's right. Yeah.
Now we come closer.
Of course, we need everything. I mean, we have a daughter company in Norway called Norsk E-Fuel, in order to produce synthetic gasoline, especially kerosene for the aviation industry. Mm-hmm. Because they have lots of renewable electricity over there, and they have cheap electricity. So you might produce the kerosene and the gasoline for about €3 per liter, something like this. Mm-hmm. So for the beginning.
CO2 air capture? Or
it's with CO2 air capture.
With air capture. Okay.
I mean, CO2 is another topic that's quite
CO2
quite
is a very nice substance, because you only need about 30 or 35 bar to make it liquid. You can transport it with the same ships. You put the methanol on, and you have enough point sources. You don't have to scrape it from the air. But
the problem is the regulation. If you have an electric car, then you can take your daily grid mix. Yeah? If you have hydrogen or e-fuel, you need to invest into a new renewable energy source. You cannot use the existing renewable energy in order to become quoted. And that makes it complicated, especially in Norway. They have a waste of renewable, but it's old and therefore it's cheap.
May I just jump in at this point?
Please.
Because I think that's an interesting argument. Because as an economist, I'm perfectly agnostic about which technology is going to win in the end. And we should certainly leave degrees of freedom to private actors to choose among technologies. And because all technologies have their strengths and weaknesses, and specific fields where they make sense and where they don't make sense. And so I think, because we are talking about, or initially we are talking about a meaningful policy framework. And from that perspective, my question, first of all, is, so where does the government really need to intervene and to invest public money in order to spur new technologies? And so I think it's important to differentiate between the technologies which are under discussion at the moment, because I think there's differences here. So if you think like of e-fuels, you could argue that much of the infrastructure is already there. So you only have to switch the fuel from a fossil fuel to a renewables-based fuel, because so you could argue there's not so much a need for public investment there, because like the infrastructure is already there. And this is totally different to hydrogen, where you need, well, depending on how much you are able to use the existing gas infrastructure, but to a decent amount, you will need a new infrastructure. So an infrastructure usually requires public investment. If you want to build up a new infrastructure, there's usually the need for startup money, public startup money. And the same with infrastructure for charging, for e-mobility. Again, there you could argue that there is at least some need for government provision, at least initially, or when you think or just to reinforce the power grids, for example, if you electrify a lot of sectors. Yeah. And I think this is, and I think that's why I would argue it's sensible that the government focuses, for example, on electric mobility or sector coupling based on electricity like heat pumps and hydrogen, because I would argue that's where the highest needs for government intervention are. And that's not primarily in the area of e-fuels, for example, because I think, Frank Atzler, you said that they are already, I mean, they're cheap, they're available, they're easy, they can be scaled up quickly. And if that's the case, I mean, that can be done privately by private businesses. Maybe that's why there's not so much need for public investment, but that's in other sectors.
I've learned from Toyota that they say, and I thought this is an important argument. If you build up a hydrogen fueling infrastructure, at a certain point, there's a certain number of filling stations. Yeah, it's okay, it's enough. But with the charging infrastructure, you need, let's say, a kind of a relative number to the number of cars of charging points. So the more the electric cars increase, the more charging points you need. Mm-hmm. And this is especially true when it comes to fast charging possibilities on the highways, on the autobahns. Yeah, then it gets really a disaster when we look for a mass suitable infrastructure, which is with a hydrogen infrastructure. I've had a number in my memories, which is about 4 billion euro for hydrogen infrastructure, filling infrastructure, and about 300 billion for charging infrastructure.
I can easily imagine that. Yeah, the sheer number.
So we talk about a factor of 100. Yeah. Yeah. So obviously that's the case, but there's one problem, and I'm very much interested to hear your opinions. I've learned from a guy from Daimler Fuel Cells in Narbonne. There is no technology for mass suitable filling
hydrogen.
Of hydrogen. There's no technology existing where you can fill at one filling station 400 events per day.
The question
of
is
5 to 6 kilograms.
I think what it boils down to is not is there a technology, but what he probably meant was there is a technology, but it's too slow and too expensive, and what we need is a cheap, robust technology for everyday use.
Yes. Yeah,
and so that I can imagine.
The low pressure technology, for example, which is mainly used in what I know in Germany. So you have the hydrogen stored in 50 bar, and then you compress it to up to 800 bars, and you cool down to minus 40 degrees for the filling event. Yeah, and you have shown how much losses you have just by this process. But when you look at the 50 bar, there's a big vessel at the Stuttgart airport. Yeah, maybe everybody knows this. The volume is good for 40 filling events.
Yes, I know.
Not more.
I know.
So if you want to have 400, you need to have 10 of these vessels, and you have to bring the hydrogen liquefied.
That is how they tanker it.
Is not possible.
That's how they tanker it around in Germany. They use
and when I think about, and we have had these discussions in the national platform Future of Mobility in the working group 1. When you think about what this means for heavy duty trucks,
forget it.
Yeah. So and then it gets complicated.
Well, they need to refill every 4 hours when they have their break.
Yeah, exactly.
But they should have their break and not refill the vehicle.
Exactly.
But anyway, so that's the way it's done.
Yeah, but when I say 400 filling events is the average of the German 14,000 something filling stations. Yeah. So gas stations. So we have 400 in the average. This includes the 3,000 at the Autobahn, at one gas station, and this includes 20 in somewhere in a rural area. So in the average, it's 400. So we have to have a technology which is able to do this.
Of course, you need some local electrolyzers for sure in order to fulfill the hydrogen consumption. I mean, we have at the moment a project. The unit should start in beginning of 2022, where we have a 3.5 megawatt electrolyzer installed at the premises of Emprise in Austria. They want to fill their trucks with it, so they're buying a fleet of hydrogen trucks and want to use it locally. Of course, it's a big difference from a nowadays gasoline petrol station and the consumption over there.
I don't see.
Actually, I don't have the number in mind. What is the energy consumption of today's gasoline station? No idea. But of course, it's a challenge to compress to 800 bar. In a substantial amount of volume flow in several steps. Yeah. There are only a certain number of technologies available for this at the moment. I don't think that will be a big problem. It's more a problem of investment than of technology.
Yeah, when we talk about investment, there is a direct electrolysis filling station in Hamburg. The costs were 2.8 million euro. Yeah. For this station, and they produce 3 kilograms of hydrogen per hour.
Yeah, of course, but it's the same like
experimental.
Yeah, it's the same like Mr. Benz in the past. His wife went to a local pharmacy to buy
exactly gasoline.
That's exactly the point. So the amount is so low that the capex is incredibly high. That's for sure, but that's of course not the bet on the future.
But we talk about, the EU Commission talks about zero CO2 emissions in 2035. So within 14 years, yeah, we have to bring out all kinds of CO2 emissions from cars, yeah? For new cars. Yeah? They don't talk about the existing fleet. Yeah. So, and when we discuss all this in the moment, and we discuss from the standpoint of a very rich country here in Germany, it's enough to go somewhere in Europe, more not so rich countries, but when we leave Europe, in other areas of the world, can anyone imagine how this can work?
Well, that was another argument that I really like to use, and you not only have to go to Africa or to somewhere else to find this problem. If you look at people who can only afford one car, so they wouldn't have one battery car to do the runaround during the week and then use the whatever fuel cell car or the diesel or the gasoline car for the weekend and for the holidays to do the long range stuff. If you take the average salary in Germany, it's supposed to be something like 30 or 35,000 euros a year. So now you take off the top 2%, and the whole curve runs down to something like 25 or even only 20,000 euros. And then you have to ask the question: if someone buys a small car, a Corsa, a Panda, a Ford car, something like this, could this possibly or reasonably be electrified, or is the battery so overwhelmingly expensive, or the fuel cell for that matter, that you rather go with a 1 liter 3-cylinder methanol engine, which costs the same price as before the gasoline engine? You can still sell the car for 10,000 and people can afford it. And the rest of the world, yes, I fully agree, they don't want high tech, they want robust, usable, cheap. And that is what we should deliver in a CO2 neutral manner. And it's possible.
Yeah, that's the point. CO2 neutral.
Yes.
When CO2 neutral would be accepted,
Yes.
yeah, then I would say the solutions are much more realistic.
CO2 neutral is one thing, and not decarbonized, but defossilized. So leave the fossil carbon in the ground, make a whole circular carbon economy, and do that worldwide. That, I think, would be a good idea.
Any arguments? Any additions?
Maybe one observation from my point of view. The elephant in the room seems to be the ban on combustion cars.
Yes.
So because we haven't mentioned that explicitly. Because I mean, if you don't have a ban on internal combustion cars, then everything what you're saying is fine, because nobody is preventing from using an ICE car with e-fuels or with methanol. If that's profitable, people will do that. So all these issues you mentioned only arise if we implement a ban. So if we explicitly prohibit.
No, it's even worse. It's even worse. We have ministries in the government which are definitely against combustion engines even before they are banned. So they do everything to prevent any progress. So
but there's a difference here. I mean, I think you can fairly argue that it makes sense to promote hydrogen and to promote electric mobility, that as long as you don't rule out other options, and then I think that would be a fair regulatory framework, because as I mentioned before, there are differences in the maturity of the technologies.
Depends on how you do it.
So the issue really comes if you think about bans, and I mean obviously the EU is now with the Fit for 55 package is also discussing a ban, but actually they are not very explicit here, because they are actually what they are proposing is a ban on fossil fueled ICE cars, whatever that means.
It's more.
If you look at the way it's run currently, and that doesn't even refer to the last statements, but the last couple of years, then you see a battery car is counted 3 times zero emission, although it uses the German, the Polish, the Spanish energy mix of the grid. And the kilowatt hour is currently rated at 580 grams of CO2 equivalent, including the methane and the nitrous oxide, the N2O. So whereas e-fuels hardly appear on the list, and this is a framework where nobody wants to invest in the development of engines or in the development of e-fuels. So everybody invests into the development of electric cars because they have such an advantage, never mind whether that's physically or economically viable or sensible.
Yeah, I mean, the emission standard, I think they're a mess. They are setting a lot of wrong incentives, adverse incentives.
Actually, there are some pros and cons for the ban of ICE engines. I mean, we already have 60 million of these engines on our streets in Germany, and we need to fuel it in the future. And the next point is we have lots of aviation, we have ships and so on. All what we can produce as e-fuel should go into the technologies where there's no alternative. So for a car, there seems to be an alternative. For aviation industry, it's very, very difficult to have it. And
I perfectly agree with that. And it also, I think another important argument in favor of a ban is the commitment you demonstrate by that. Because if you don't, I mean, there's pros and cons as I mentioned, but if you have a ban, then you really set a strong signal that something needs to be done in the transportation sector. Because otherwise, if you leave it open, there's a high incentive to stick to fossil-fueled combustion cars.
So what's happening now is that you increase the number of electric cars, and you increase it, but you don't follow up with the infrastructure. So you're fueling electric cars with brown or black electricity. And that doesn't make any sense, because for the next, that is a good calculation that was not done by me, that was done by someone else. For at least up to 2030, most numbers say up to 2035, we will not see a decrease in the carbon dioxide from transport because we electrify everything. And obviously, I mean, I'm repeating myself, if you import the right stuff from the sun belt of the earth and you give other people a chance to produce it, or you even invest in it, then you do it much more and much better. And as you said yourself, you can use the same infrastructure, but you don't need a charging column for everybody, but 1,000 or 10,000 people use the same filling station as we did up to now, which is a good system. It's cheap, it's robust, and it works, and it's good for everybody. So yes, but apparently this is too simple, not sexy enough, and there's certainly someone coming around and say, oh, it's all the old stuff, and that's only the combustion guys wanting their business back. Well, fair enough. I'm not selling engines, I can easily say that.
But there's one point, and I don't know when our wonderful 1 hour of discussion is.
In about 10 minutes.
In about 10 minutes. So we can talk about two other topics also within these 10 minutes. But what I always think about is we have a nice gold standard. We have more or less combustion engines. Yeah, they can be hybridized, okay, no problem. We have an increasing number of battery electric cars, okay. There are good reasons for this. But we have a kind of a world standard. And we have a global automotive industry. And I remember very well the days at Daimler when they decided in the truck department to develop a world standard engine. Mm. At the end, it was a little bit different in case of exhaust gas recirculation and whatever. So the emission, the after treatment was difficult, but the base engine was the same. And this is something very important in this industry, yeah, because this keeps the prices low. And especially we have products for the niche markets. Look at whatever, and big trucks for any kind of usage where the tires are 4 meters in diameter.
In mines and
in mines and in every case, down to small engines and all that. All this works more or less on a world standard. And the prices are relatively low because the technology can be shared between those things. And I'm a little bit afraid that the world falls apart in the moment, because every area in the world tries to find, very much politically driven, to find their solution. Yeah, and they force the industry in a way that they don't have any chance to say, well, from a technological view, we need to have global solutions. No, it doesn't. It doesn't. Well, yeah, Japan does something different. In Southeast Asia, methanol gets more and more popular, and China has just changed their strategy, and so on and so on. And I see, so, from my opinion, and I'm very much interested to get your opinions. Is this a problem or not?
It appears to be a problem in Germany. But if you look at the rest of the world, they're going on with combustion technology. The Chinese are bringing out ranges where you have a 500cc unit and you make it either a 4-cylinder or make it a 3-cylinder. You have it with turbo, without turbo, with or without cam shifters. You get the full raft for any kind of engine or mobility requirement. Well, that's passenger cars, obviously. And I think they will sell this kind of, what's the word for Baukastensystem? Is like out of building blocks. It's modular.
It's modular,
and this kind of modular technology will sell for the next 50 years to come. The only ones who will not sell anything are the Germans because they don't do it anymore. Well, they will do, but not in Germany. Daimler will have plants as they already do in China or in America, and Volkswagen do. BMW, I don't know, but yeah, and they do have facilities in America. So they will just pull out of Germany and do it elsewhere.
I mean, isn't this diversity a chance for everybody here? I mean, we are talking on students here in the auditorium. So developing something new to bring costs down on the new technology is much more fancy than just improving a screw in the cylinder somewhere. Maybe from your point of view, it might be challenging enough, no idea, but nevertheless, we have a diversity of solutions. We don't know what is the best technology. There might be all technologies having some room in the future, but from an engineering point of view, it's a good thing to have new things, to start with demonstrations, then to have a mass manufacturing, bring down costs to a certain value. So I see this race of technologies, even driven by governments with different politics, I see it more or less positive. It will find the best way.
Absolutely agreed. Absolutely agreed. There are purposes for electrically driven vehicles, for hydrogen-driven vehicles, and for whatever methanol or artificial gasoline. If you look at, as you said, the old fleet, there was 47 million passenger cars and another 10 million trucks or so. They all need to be
1 billion worldwide.
It's yeah, 1 point something, 1.25 or 1.3. But they all need to be defossilized, and for these we need new fuels. That's one race. We need to have electric drives to either run them for a certain range, only electric in cities, for example.
Range extenders,
Yeah, and you need reasonable range extenders. You don't need a 200 kilowatt engine in these cars. You maybe get away with 40 or 50 kilowatts, and that's perfect. So there are many solutions that can be thought of. The only thing that doesn't work is if you have a completely closed race where one particular item is preferred, and this is like a dogma, a religious dogma, and this is what we see now, that certain technical solutions are preferred to other ones and get privileges and subsidies that the others don't get, and that makes the whole thing unrealistic, unfair. It doesn't make it sexy or interesting. It's just like, oh, that one's the one that's preferred and that's subsidized, and we have to go for that.
But for example, I'll give you a simple example. Heavy-duty trucks have today 3 lives. Their first life is here in Germany, or let's say in the middle of Europe, and the second life is somewhere at the borders, typically in the eastern direction. The first life is 2 million kilometers, the second life is another 2 million, and then the car goes to the Near East or somewhere
Middle
East. Middle
East,
or Africa. So
another 2 million kilometers.
Another 2 million. So we talk about 6 million kilometers. We talk about 20,000 hours of operation. This is a true challenge for every alternative. A very true challenge. But anyway, this chain is cutting.
If you
go forced by politics to a technology which is not available in the countries outside Europe,
then you buy a Chinese truck or Ford Otosan,
exactly.
or
exactly. So everything here in our no, I don't want to be rebooted. But that's something we have to take into account, I would say, because otherwise everything will get not cheaper; it will get more expensive. And look for example for agriculture, those tractors. If there are for the tractor, I'm very much sure e-fuels will be accepted in the future, because it's not really imaginable that we have a battery electric tractor. Yeah?
A huge harvester runs
but if
maximum 4 weeks a year.
Would use these engines for the tractors, solely for tractors, that's a totally different thing as it is today. Yeah. So, and I'm very much sure we will not produce tractors in Europe anymore. They will be all imported from China. For sure.
The other interesting thing is who does the development work. I mean, we have now engineers who are trained at university, and they learn things and they want to develop things. And we have very good research facilities in Germany now, but will we have them in the future when anyone else does that stuff, but not us?
This brings me to the final question. I always like to say at the end of my speeches, in Germany is a small country in the world concert. And we have a chance only if we do complicated, complex things. Because in the past, we have lost everything which got too simple.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it has to be complicated, and we have to prove everything. Yeah. Is it complicated enough that it has a chance to stay with research, development, production, and all that here in Germany? Germany has still 33% of their jobs in industry, where we are the leaders in Europe in this case. Yeah, France, for example, has only 22. Yeah. So, and is the future, we are thinking here about powertrains in the future. Is it complex and complicated enough that it can stay here in Germany and create jobs in the whole chain from research to production?
That's a very difficult to answer now, since I advocated a robust, simple, and easy to produce system. Oh, damn!
That's perfect for imports. That's perfect for the Chinese to be happy about all that.
But the chemical industry needs to develop the processes in big scale. You need to do electrolysers to get the hydrogen, because we need the hydrogen as the base.
Therefore, I'm sitting here to promote electrolysers, not the old ICE engine. Everybody can.
No.
But we have an advantage in electrolysers.
The hydrogen enough. And there's enough
potential at the moment that it's complicated
for development. Yeah. I'm completely with you, and I say wonderful. That's exactly what it is. So my only point is we have to check.
Yeah.
Is it complicated enough? And if it's not, we can forget it.
Every car will be hybridized to some extent, and it needs a proper strategy, an operating strategy, which needs to be developed, and you need mathematics and simulation, and you can make it as complicated as you wish.
Yeah, wonderful. That's perfect. Perfect product. A perfect product for research, for development, and for production as well. So I think we are at the point to look at the questions from the audience.
Your finest, you should have them on the screen.
I only wanted to have the go. The go, yeah.
I think it can also be discussed in the whole round. So I think the discussion will continue.
That's from the picture. I would guess. We have a female attendee, and she's asking, Sarita is her name, and she is asking, could you please quickly state, what do you think would be the best fuel for each? Cars, trucks, which means trucks, cars and trucks and trains and ships and airplanes.
In the past, we relied on certain fractions out of the petrochemical industries, and they were more or less set. So if you boil oil, you get very light fractions, you get the kerosene, you get the gasoline, you get the diesel, then you get the heavy fractions. And so each of these fractions was used by certain parts of the industry for certain things. Now this will change, And I don't know whether it'll be methanol, but methanol could be run in any vehicle, I guess, even in ships. As we heard, ammonia can be run in ships, hydrogen can be run in all sorts of applications, although hydrogen is a slightly not complex, but to some extent dangerous substance, because it burns very, very, very quickly in all sorts of dilutions. So
and you cannot see the flame.
And neither you can with methanol. So it's very difficult to answer. I would probably go that way and say passenger cars may be to a large extent electric, but maybe not at the pace we do it at the moment, because we don't have the electricity, the green electricity. Hydrogen may be for the medium power, medium range things, and the liquid fuels, especially heavy fuels, will be more for tractors, full load, 24 hours all day long, trains which cannot be electrified economically, ships, and a lot. So there will be a sharing of certain sources, but how exactly that will look like, I don't know. What do you say?
Actually, I don't have the final answer. Personally, I believe we need a high share of e-fuel in aviation, because it's the most difficult thing to have an alternative. Mm-hmm. For medium distance transport like ferries or trains without electrification, we might have hydrogen as the best solution, because it's easy then to have a hub with enough consumption over there. For ships, the people there are talking about e-fuel, about compressed or liquefied natural gas, ammonia, but it's difficult. It's a very slow industry. It's very complex.
Fossil.
Yeah, it's very complex to change the infrastructure over there. So I believe also e-fuel might be the easiest thing, but of course then the transport of goods from Asia to Europe is more expensive.
Yes, the transport costs will matter in the future.
It will all become.
That's what I guess.
Maybe that's a necessity.
And this will change economy.
Yeah,
the economy.
It's good for the industry.
Yeah, that's good for our industry. That's no question.
And for passenger cars, it could be a mixture of batteries and e-fuels, I believe.
Well, I can't add much to that, because as I said, I'm an economist, not an engineer. But we did a study for Agora Verkehrswende jointly with researchers from IFOI in Heidelberg, and it pretty much depended on your time horizon. I mean, when it comes to 2030, 2040, I think they pretty much agree with what you said. So maybe to make it a bit stronger, their strong opinion was that for passenger transport, for private individualized mobility, it will be electrified totally, and hydrogen only comes in for freight or large duty vehicles and so on. But we should also be aware that if we think, I mean, now we are talking about carbon neutrality in 2045. This is, of course, a totally different perspective, and there it's much harder to actually predict. And even if you have, and I think that's also been said, even if you may be able to say roughly where the main uses are, there may still be niches where other fuels may come in. So it's hard to so you may be able to predict the more or less main uses, but it's really hard to predict shares like within each type of use. And that's where we need some flexibility.
Yeah, I give you an interesting niche because the company is very close to where I live in Stuttgart, in fact in Weiblingen. Maybe everybody knows where Weiblingen is. Exactly. The company Stihl is the biggest producer of two-stroke engines in the world. Meanwhile, and they produce 3 million items per year. And they clearly say the potential for electrifying chainsaws is in the amateur market.
Yeah.
In the professional market, where you go in the woods, they don't see any potential to go away from two-stroke engines and liquid fuels.
It's funny you say that, because I was just looking up the so-called MS-880. That's a chainsaw with a sword 75 centimeters long. And I was just talking,
2 meters.
I was just talking, for the World Championships, they have 400 cc two-strokes with about 30 horsepower. But what they say is they want to go for dimethyl carbonate, DMC. This is a very, very nice fuel, even for another combustion engine like a diesel. However, we were just talking about this on the weekend. It is made with a catalyst that contains a lot of platinum. So it's not a cheap solution for the mass market. So DMC they want to distribute it via their own dealer net.
Exactly.
So it's, you don't get it at the fuel station.
But it is not. If you dream about a total avoidance of CO2 emissions from any exhaust pipe in the world, no, this is not a solution.
It's only carbon neutral.
It's carbon neutral. That's exactly the point.
We will not have a carbon-free world. That is nonsense. We will have a carbon neutral world.
4% of if you breathe out, 4% of this is CO2.
Yeah, but that's taken up by the trees.
There's a little sign. It's a little sign. This is taken by the trees.
It's a closed carbon cycle.
Okay, before I read the next question, it just fits excellent. Just guess how much CO2 is emitted by a horse when it runs, roughly speaking, 30 kilometers per hour. So very quickly.
I've got a clue.
The same amount as a Porsche Cayenne.
Oh, come on.
Yeah, 230 grams per kilometer. And when
I have calculated for a human. I think this might be a number from the automotive industry, but I have the feeling it's completely ridiculous. It's 10 times lower, the CO2 emission of a horse.
So
it means what you calculate. Of course, the horse consumes renewables in a closed loop somehow.
Yes, the barn. When you have the horse in the barn, it emits more or less the same amount of CO2 as a car when idling.
Possibly. Possibly, yes.
And that's one of the reasons why a horse avoids to lay down usually.
But if you compare, say, a cyclist consumes a very good one, 200 watt, something like that. And if you compare what is the newton that he needs for this 200 watt compared to a car that drives the same distance, then the cyclist or the human is much more effective. Maybe it's a bit different than the horse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
but you need to compare the right things to each other. Yeah?
So
you need everything you need to calculate it on the internet. If you believe to Wikipedia, it's not difficult to calculate it. But anyway,
we will abolish the horse and we will invent the electric horse. How about that?
Now I would say it's not a good idea to exchange 47 million cars in Germany by 47 million horses. That's the only thing I want to say. Anyway, to Professor Lehmann, in case of application of carbon tax, how would you ensure that the actual tax amount reaches communities most likely to be negatively affected by the emitted CO2 and that the money offsets the emissions?
You wouldn't.
Have you understood?
First of all, that's not the idea of carbon pricing. That's only a side effect of carbon pricing, I would say. The main effect of carbon pricing is to allocate or to reduce emissions and to trigger emissions where they are cheapest. But obviously it has a side benefit or this co-benefit of generating revenues which can be used for public purposes. And that's the one debate we have in Germany at the moment, because one option, but there it's not so much directed to vulnerability, but rather to increasing acceptance for climate policy by redistributing, by recycling those revenues back to people on a per capita basis. So that doesn't fully answer your question, but so there is a huge debate on how to recycle those revenues. And obviously you can also recycle them to and focus them on green investments, or to fund investments in adaptation to climate change, which is going to happen anyway. But how well or good or bad this actually happens obviously depends a lot of institutional strengths and political willingness. So I'd say it's very hard to provide general guidelines here. I mean, obviously they raise the revenues, but how well or not they are used, that depends on the system.
I think the idea that one particular tax with the name of it is only there for one particular issue to be solved, or to be solved, is completely wrong. A tax is just an income for the state, and it can be distributed to all sorts of things.
Yeah.
With a carbon dioxide tax, you might finance universities or health, or whatever, rural development, or whatever
It's
else.
also a control instrument.
It's a control instrument.
If you can increase it and you make it more expensive, you look at the fuel tax.
Well, in public finance, it has two functions.
Yeah.
One is the allocative function, which is reduce emissions, allocate scarce resources to where they're most needed. And the second one is the public funding function. And obviously, it's up to the public how they use those funds. But as I said, since there's a lot of, I mean, we had the Yellow Vest protest in France, so there's a lot of political concern about political opposition against carbon taxes, or increasing carbon prices, maybe more generally, not only taxes, could also be a trading scheme, which has the same effect. It makes carbon-intensive products more expensive. And so earmarking those revenues to climate-related investments, or transferring them back on a per capita basis as a climate dividend, for example, may be one means to actually increase public support for climate policy. So that's, I mean, I perfectly agree with you. You can actually use it for any purpose you want. It's public money. It's not like fixed to a specific purpose, but there's good reasons to actually use it for climate related purposes, for green investments, or just redistribute it back to the people.
Another question. And I think this is an interesting question for all of you. It talks about it's so long, I have to shrink it a little bit. But it's interesting. If you compare efficiencies, what you have done with battery electric cars and fuel cell cars and combustion engine cars. Usually combustion engine cars are brought into this comparison, which are not hybridized. So there's no brake energy recuperation, which increases efficiency.
Yes.
So the comparison is not fair. And on the other hand, with a fuel cell, it depends very much with how much load the fuel cell is operated. If it's a high load operation, this goes to you, then the efficiency is much lower. And in addition, for fuel cells as well as for battery electric cars, we have to take into account the heating purposes in winter time.
Yes.
Yeah, which is which is significant.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and if you take all this together, yeah, we end up in maybe a different view on those kind of comparisons.
There was a nice article not so long ago in I think it was Automobile Review, a Swiss little paper, and I don't know how scientific it was, but when you look at all the numbers, it's completely right. If you look at battery cars under extreme conditions in winter, and you have screen wipers on and the heater on and the lights are on, and you need additional energy, then obviously if you count that in, then efficiency goes down. If you take a hybridized car, it might be much better. But what it all boils down to when you compare battery, hybrids, hydrogen, purely combustion engine driven cars, you have a corridor of some 13 to 16, 70%, and they all are down in the same range if you do a comparison long term, all conditions in weather, usage, whatever. And if you, before all, not do only a tank to wheel, but a well to wheel analysis. That was the most important thing. Where does the hydrogen come from? Where does the electricity come from? How is it transferred? What logistics are behind it? Have you a gaseous fuel? Do you have to pressurize it? Do you have to liquefy it? All these things. And if you then make a fair comparison, it all ends in the same sort of range, which is not too far apart. And then I come back to the argument I had earlier in my talk. Look at the most robust, cheapest and scalable technology to give the world carbon neutral, i.e. defossilized energy, and you've solved the whole thing. And there's nothing dogmatic about it.
Mm-hmm.
If I may add to that, and generally I tend to emphasize that this efficiency perspective is a very narrow one. This is only one small part of the entire technology choice problem. Because it's also investment costs. I mean, it's not only because efficiency primarily relates to the production of fuels, but I mean, you also need to invest in technologies that use these fuels, and there may be differences there. And then there's non-monetary costs. I mean, one issue with battery electric vehicles obviously is range, and that's a non-monetary cost in economic terms. And so there may be differences in the utility you get from different technologies. That needs to be taken into account. And then also there may be limitations, and I think that's what Frank Atzler also mentioned, to the availability, that the scarcity may be different. And all this needs to be taken into account. This is not to say that efficiency is meaningless, but it's only too small a picture, only a small part of the entire picture. But I mean, obviously you can also turn it around, because if you discuss, for example, about the costs and availability of technologies produced abroad outside Europe, because usually you would assume there's huge potential there and that can be fairly cheaply produced there and then imported. Obviously, you also need to account for non-monetary or for additional costs which matter there. I mean, political uncertainty is a huge factor which determines how meaningful investments there are, or many investors may be deterred because of political uncertainty in these areas. I mean, we've had this Desert Trek initiative, which primarily failed, although a lot of money was put into that for a variety of political reasons. And also because when we think of the Sun Belt, like where there's a lot of sun, we only think of the levelized cost of electricity generation. But for example, there's a lot of economic research looking also at the cost of capital. And interestingly, for example, the cost of capital in Germany is very low compared to Southern Europe, and even more so compared to Africa or like further away areas. And that may change the entire story. So that's another criterion which needs to be taken into account when we try to compare technologies on a cost basis. So it's really a really complex issue to compare the costs or the economic efficiency of different technologies.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm not an expert in life cycle analysis. That's the typical way to go in order to compare technologies. But my feeling is it really depends on who pays for the study.
Oh, obviously, yes.
And this person then sets the border or the battery limits of the how do you see it.
Yeah.
If you really make a well-to-wheel analysis with all including losses of, say, natural gas, if you produce oil, things like that, then it really becomes complicated.
It really does.
It's the same with the production of batteries, with the production of cars and so on.
It does. And what I always see is new technologies have, of course, a high potential. Mm-hmm. And those kind of studies are usually made in a way that they refer to this potential for the new technologies, and they take, let's be polite, the average of an existing technology without looking for the potential for this technology. Mm-hmm. Also. And that's what this, the one who asked here referred to when he said there's no, you compare pure combustion engine cars with other solutions which have by principle take energy recuperation on board. Yeah, and that's exactly what it's all about. And I have heavy discussions with, we have an expert at the University of Stuttgart about life cycle analysis. And he as a result, he tries, and what he does now, he always asks the experts of every field. He does not rely only on what you can find on literature. And this is maybe something for all the attendees of this panel discussion here of high importance. And this is something my doctor father told me in very, very long ago. And he said, you have to reach the knowledge that you can read an article and at the end you can say what is wrong in this article.
Oh, that's a very good suggestion.
Yeah, and I like this, but I do not want to come to an end without, and we have the expert here about fuel cells, and there was just published a study, a comparison for heavy-duty trucks between fuel cell solution and hydrogen combustion engine. And the interesting result was it's on the same level.
Okay. Actually, I'm not an expert in fuel cells for transportation, yeah. Only for stationary applications. If you would ask me about this, for sure I could.
A little bit different.
But it's a little bit different, yeah. But anyway, in a fuel cell, you have losses, and if the electrical, the current density is high, then the voltage drops. And then you have higher consumption, is for sure. But at the end, it's the same like hybridization. So you need a battery to store it. To have an intermediate load on the fuel cell.
Yeah, you have to phlegmatize.
Yeah, and it might be the same if you have an internal combustion engine operated with hydrogen and load a battery. Not to go up and down in the cycles, yes. But I'm not an expert in this. But I know, of course, there was a trial of BMW to develop an internal combustion engine based on hydrogen. They failed on the storage of hydrogen.
No, they failed on several counts because they made it a dual fuel, so they couldn't get the maximum efficiency of either fuel out, and there were other things.
They had a port fuel injection.
So the efficiency of a fuel cell might be 60% in a car. Maximum, yeah.
I don't very low loads.
If it runs power low,
very low loads.
Yeah, it's always a question of the cost of the engine compared to the outcome. So if you have high cost, then the efficiency is high. If you want to have low cost, then the efficiency drops down. And there seems to be an optimum in the economics.
And what I've learned also, there is a severe thermal management problem because at higher loads, you don't have the wonderful exhaust gas energy to bring out the losses from the engine. With the fuel cell, you have to do everything with radiators. And the temperature level is relatively low, which makes it difficult to deliver 400 kilowatt permanently.
But maybe you don't need it because you have a battery.
Yeah,
in the car. You don't need the maximum load.
This depends on how many hills you want to climb up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even for a truck, yes.
Yeah. For the truck, this is because the Rocky Mountains are really tough for something like this.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, it was surprising to me because when you said it depends who pays for it. In this case, it was very objective and from the Immobil BW, which is more or less paid from the government. And so it was very surprising to me that the end was, we have to continue developing both, because today you cannot say which will make the race at the end. But it was just interesting to me. It was the first time that I've read something like this. So, time to wrap up. Maybe one more question, but this is not a question. So, well, I would say one last question. Do you think what is proposed in the Fit for 55 is realistic and can be achieved? Who wants to start?
I didn't read it, but if it says 55% reduction
and 100% in 2035.
Okay, let's just stick to the 100%.
Mm-hmm.
And I clarify for myself, it's not 100% carbon free, because that is frankly nonsense. It will be 100% carbon neutral. If we go that way to start now to invest in Patagonia, Australia, Siberia, wherever, we just leave politics out of this for now. Morocco, I mean, Tunisia and Libya is not the right place right now. You would probably agree, Paul. But so if we start now to invest and make this happen, to put up photovoltaics fields, because PV is maybe not as efficient as a wind turbine, but it's much cheaper, nothing moves. And then you do your hydrolysis and get your hydrogen. So you have either electricity or hydrogen, or you make something with the hydrogen, like the methanol route. Yes, it's doable. It's just, you need to start now.
Otherwise, 14 years are much too short.
You just need to go ahead now. You need to start.
So I'm afraid we are a bit late for achieving these targets. Just to calculate what's the amount of electrolyzers we need then at that time. So we are planning to have maybe in 6 years 1 gigawatt yearly production. In order to produce the primary energy or the transportation fuel here in Germany, we need 150 gigawatt. Okay, we are only one company, of course, but nevertheless, also the other companies, they have these troubles of investment and to make it reliable, to convince also the government that we need fixed targets for 20 years, for 30 years, so that we get the investment money from the banks. But then nevertheless, it's a huge effort to have all this engineering, to have the plants erected, to run the production, then to have the investment in the e-fuels. Yeah.
Is there a way of making the electrolyzer maybe less efficient, but and it can be larger? We have no restrictions. It doesn't have to be miniaturized. It doesn't have to have so is there a way of making an electrolyzer cheaper, maybe less efficient, but scalable, so you can just go into huge factories, and if you put them in the desert, nobody asks because you have space? Is there a way to do this, to make them?
Yes, there is a way. Of course, you can increase the current density. That's the same like in the fuel cell. If you increase the current density, then you increase the losses. So you need more electricity. That's the same thing.
Yeah.
But of course, you can make it scalable. And if you have enough investment and enough trust into your technology, it should be possible. But I'm afraid it needs more than 5-7 years. If you're the owner from Tesla, so he might be more ambitious than we are. But maybe the circumstances in the US for venture capital might be different than we have it here.
This agrees excellent with what Mr. Warnecke from Shell tells me. It takes 7 years to build up a plant which is able to produce significant amounts of e-fuels.
Yeah, but imagine in 7 years we could have cracked it. We could just have hydrogen.
Yeah, but we have to start now.
Yes.
That's
what I'm saying.
You are the one with the last
closing statement.
Well, if we talk about possible possibilities, and of course we need to distinguish between technical and political or societal possibilities. I think there are sufficient studies who show that it would be possible technically. Also carbon neutrality by 2050. Obviously, we should be aware that this, as you said, is carbon neutrality, and it might involve a substantial amount of negative emissions, so subtracting CO2 from the atmosphere. So all that needs to be taken into account. But from what I understand, at least there's a sufficient amount of scenarios who suggest that it's possible technically. And so the decisive question is really whether it's politically and societally possible. And that's also, I think, where much bigger doubts are, of course, if we can sufficiently convince people to undertake, so not individuals, but also firms to undertake sufficient investments. And that, of course, eventually depends on how committed and how stringent and how ambitious policymakers are. And I do have certain concerns. I mean, I think we will be able to be more ambitious, but I do have some concerns that whether we will be ambitious enough. And I think one important policy instrument or one important component of the instrument mix in order for policies to be ambitious is really the social part of this social mitigation part. And that's why it is important, for example, that the European Commission in its Fit for 55 package has also set up climate social fund, I think it's called, with which they intend to mitigate social implications of climate policy. Because I think that's really a must, both for national and European and also other countries' climate policies, that we try to implement climate policy, ambitious climate policy from the very beginning, with strategies how to mitigate with adverse social impacts, being aware that not everybody who claims he has to bear a burden is really a need to get a subsidy. So that's the issue there. Many people are raising their hands, of course, that they want to receive money if we have more stringent policy. So that's a tricky issue there to distinguish between those who are in need to get support and those who don't. But if we are able to find smart solutions there, then I would be more confident. And it's not going to work without that.
So I'm very, very thankful that you brought in at the end this social aspect, because this is really something which is really important, I would say, and it's one of the important key factors for the whole thing. So many thanks to all of you, many thanks to the technicians to making this all possible, and it worked perfectly well. Many thanks to the audience who gave questions, and it was all fun. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you too.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation and the organization.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Thank you very much for your attention, and obviously very much thank you very much to the panelists for this very fruitful, very informed, and also very lively discussion. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as we did, and we hope to see you tomorrow at 9 again, where we will tackle the topics of the impact of digitalization on future supply chains. We hope to see you tomorrow at 9 again, and until then, goodbye.